Hi, everyone. My name is Don Hahn, and I'm your host today as we talk to the directors of Wolfwalkers. Hi, guys. How you doing?
Hey Dan,
Too
thanks for
bad, Don. Thanks for having us.
Yeah, it's a pleasure. It's good to see you. So, Tomm Moore, Ross Stewart, I personally am a big fan of this movie. So, this next hour or so should be really fun because I'm going to interrogate you about so many things that I want to know about how you approach this movie. Because I think it's a really exciting film, story-wise and visually too. And those of you listening in, if you have questions along the way, don't hesitate to just post them in the chat box, and we'll collate them and get to as many of them as we can before we're done here. So thanks for tuning in. So guys, when I think of an animated film, a wolf story about Oliver Cromwell is not the first thing that springs to mind, but it excites me that you chose this topic. Yeah, yes, it's an exciting topic because it's local to you guys, which I think is great. Which was a surprise to me when I read the history of the inspiration of it. I was kind of had no idea that was in your history. And secondly, the next movie you do, you need to choose something like the Bahamas or Hawaii or something. The field trip was not that great. Mm-hmm. But tell me a little bit about that, and then I'd love you to talk just about your process and kind of show us some of what you went through to get this amazing movie up on the screen. But what about the genesis of this? Where did this idea come from?
Yeah, I can talk about that a little bit. I brought a little presentation. I can go into some more details, but it basically came, I think you know Brenda Chapman, and Ross and I went to a story workshop she gave in Dublin about 7 years ago. And we had already been working again with another colleague of yours, I'm sure, Roger Allers, on The Prophet. And we were doing a little piece on that together. And we wanted to come up with an idea that would be like a third installment in our kind of folklore triptych or trilogy or whatever. And so we literally over lunch came up with the basic genesis of the story. And the idea was to base it on, as you said, local legends here in Kilkenny about the wolf people of Ossory that were pagans that wouldn't convert for St. Patrick. So he put a curse on them that they would be wolves when they would howl when he was preaching to disrupt his sermons. So he put a curse on them that they'd be wolves when they slept and humans by day. And so we thought that was an interesting folklore to delve into. And there were so many themes that we wanted to speak to, primarily about empathy, primarily about the fact that Ireland since 1650 was a very divided country because of the colonization of Cromwell, and he made a concerted effort to quote unquote tame the country by wiping out the wolves and clearing the forests. And we wanted to speak to that because that kind of division is more relevant than ever today, and the species are under threat like never before around the world, and the biosphere is under threat, and all those things seemed important things to talk about if we were to make a final piece of this kind of triptych, because those were like themes that were running through Secret of Kells and Song of the Sea. So that was it. I mean, we had the idea, and basically the core, we knew the emotional core would be the two kids, that an English kid and an Irish kid being able to be friends, even right from the earliest times of colonization, seemed like a hopeful story to tell,
Yeah, it really is. And like you said, it's really timely and it comes through strongly in the film. I'll let you get to your presentation in just a quick second here, but I'm always struck by your films, all the films from Cartoon Saloon and their visual style. And I know you'll cover this as you talk more, but approaching a movie like this in a visual style that you've used and the visual language you've selected, using there's so much great symbolism and graphic design. I just love, and the power of that is so strong as a storytelling element. Can you talk just for a second about that, and then as you want, let's go into your presentation just so we can see a little bit about the genesis of the story and kind of your thoughts along the way. But to me, the power of this story is the story itself, which is one of the strongest stories you guys have ever told, I think. And secondly, the visual language that you selected to tell it. So talk a little bit about that visual language and how that came about.
Well, I suppose like we were working with Will Collins as well during script development, and Will was the screenwriter for Song of the Sea as well. And all three of us, right from the very start, had the approach of show, don't tell, like so we don't have to explain stuff through expositional dialogue. So we would always try and show as much as we could so that the audience gets it visually. And then I suppose we broadened our horizons to use visual language to show certain things that maybe couldn't be explained through like obvious, like symbols or visuals, and like the things that we would have tried out in Secret of Kells and Song of the Sea and Breadwinner and like all the shorts and everything that we've done at Cartoon Saloon. I suppose we've been learning along the way. At the start, we might have just done it as little visual tricks, but I think for Wolfwalkers, we wanted to use it very concertedly to emphasize the story points, to help the story progress, and to maybe amplify the mood and tension and tone, and maybe the character's inner thoughts and inner dialogue as well. So it was very much a tool that could be used, in different places. It wasn't just like a visual gimmick, I think. So Tomm, myself, like being quite visually minded, I think from the very, very start would have known that we wanted these two worlds, like the world of the town and the world of the forest, to be as far apart as possible visually. And so I think we'll probably get to that in a little bit of this presentation.
I think the visual, the ideas, the themes, both the background to the story and the visual themes are stuff that, because Ross was art director on Secret of Kells, so and he was a big part of Song of the Sea in the concept stage. So there were ideas that I think have been firming up over the years, like that we've been working together. And I think we kind of almost conceived of the story both thematically and with the visuals in mind at the same time. It was very organic.
Yeah.
And yeah, maybe Cartoon Saloon should send us some more lunches in nice restaurants.
I think so. I'll send you some lunches.
So these are just, I have some images here that are from the historical record. There was a chap called Gerald of Wales who came over, and he was one of the first of it was the start of the sort of the anti-Irish propaganda back in England, but he kind of collected a lot of wonder tales and stories about, talking wolves in the forest that would lead, saints home if they were lost in the woods. And
it was like a medieval tabloid. Some stuff was true, and then some stuff was just completely made up, and it was up to the reader to decide which.
It wasn't terribly favorable to the Irish all the time, because that was the other thing we wanted to talk about, is speciesism and how we attribute like negative human characteristics to a certain species, and that's bad for the species, but it's also bad for people, because then it's very easy to call your enemies whatever that species is that you're
yes,
you want to turn everyone against. So in the 19th century, the Irish were famously compared to apes and stuff like that in Punch magazine to kind of dehumanize them. But Ross and I weren't aware that where wolves had been a really important part of Irish folklore and Irish identity, because Ireland was known to the English at the time as Wolfland, because it was known as being so untamed and so wild and all that. So the association with wolves was, showing in a negative light the project that, like, Ireland was kind of a proving ground for the British Empire, and Ireland was the first kind of colony. And so a lot of the things they tried out here, or Oliver Cromwell tried out here, to kind of show that he was even more, in control than he had been, than the king had been, Charles I, where there were tactics that were to be used again later. But what Ross and I think, realized looking at the early texts was that this connection between Irish people and wolves, and their attitude towards the wilderness and their attitudes towards the environment, was very different than what came in with colonization. This Puritan idea of being overlords of nature, and nature being something that had to be tamed, and that we were, closer to God than to animals, was replacing a more syncretic way of being. Like, we'd had Christianity since the time of St. Patrick, but it had been really mixed in with a kind of animist pagan way of seeing the world. And so we realized that by clearing the forests and wiping out the wolves, we didn't just lose forests and wolves. We lost that kind of way of seeing ourselves, and we thought
Yeah.
that was interesting to explore.
It is.
And also, it was like I was just climbing a mountain earlier on today, and it's down in Leinster, and from the top of the mountain, I was just struck, because we've been talking about this during Wolfwalkers, I was struck that like 360 degrees around, it's just all farmland, and the land is so segmented and so ordered and so like, divided up into little squares or rectangles or whatever. And I was trying to imagine that back in that day, we had like so much more forest cover around the turn of like the 1500s, 1600s. And while we might see that as being beautiful now, the Cromwellian, like the colonizers would have seen that as a place where like rebels hid, and woodkerns, and like, savages, the savage Irish, and wolves and all that. So like it was their kind of God-given mission, I suppose, to get all this wild land and order it, cut it all down and put it into ordered farmland. So what I was seeing from that mountain there was a direct, like, kind of result of that mindset.
I suppose it's
it's so interesting. As a sidebar, a lot of that Cromwellian invasion came in from Kinsale and Cork, and Roy Disney had a place in Kinsale for years and years and years. I don't know if you guys know that or not, but he had a little a place on the sea there. So there's a real kind of Disney tie, and he felt really close affinity to Ireland. The other thing, too, is that wolves in fairy tales and in mythology are demonized almost all the time, and I'm certainly guilty of that. But I was really happy in this film to see wolves portrayed as positive characters, such as it is. And I just felt like that was a really interesting turn on what is, have been hundreds of years of, wolves being the bad guy.
Yeah, and that came in through with our research into the mythology, like the whole, like, Red Riding Hood and all of the Brothers Grimm fairy tales and all of that stuff that we draw so much of our stories from. That was around that time when they viewed like the wolf as a symbol of wildness and savagery and this brutal kind of animalist nature that needed to be suppressed in humans, So it was kind of part of this Puritan way of thinking that like we are animals and we all have these instincts, but around that time it was so bad and it needed to be suppressed. So the wolf being the symbol of like this, savage wild instinct. I think that was around the time that a lot of the European fables and fairy tales and even the mindset of the Puritan society turned them into the bad guy. Because before that, if you go back in earlier Irish myths and stories, and I'm sure in German and Italian and wherever else, they were seen as just another part of the ecosystem, and they imbued, fellow traveler, I suppose, in the woods. And we came across these stories of Irish people, say, giving one of their livestock to the wolves with the hope that the wolves would leave the rest alone, and maybe paying tribute, like leaving out little presents and things, and then the wolves would protect them if they were going through the woods. So it was like it wasn't a species to be exterminated, because I think they realized that like we are animals and we do have these instincts, and it wasn't something to be ashamed of.
Yes.
But
it's amazing that it's such a rich story in terms of its mythology, its fairy tale myth, it's Joseph Campbell, whatever it is, to find right in your backyard, I think is extraordinary, and it really comes through. I love the personal nature of it in the film. It's so strong. Tell us, Tom, a little bit about the artwork we're seeing here and what you're showing.
Sure. I just wanted to share, you gave a sidebar about Roy Disney, and there's a really interesting connection. I went to the Walt Disney Family Museum in San Francisco, and I was delighted to see there was a local legend that the Disney family were from Kilkenny. And Irish people are great at claiming all sorts of stuff, so I kind of put it to one side. But when I went to the Disney Family Museum, apparently Goran, I think, here in Kilkenny, was where his like great grandfather came from, and it was they were French. So it was d'Isne. So they were obviously Normans at some point. So we've had waves of invasion. So the Disneys were obviously the French Norman settlers, like this chap here on the horse.
I wonder was his Norman ancestor like drawing cartoons on the boat over?
Maybe drawing little mice, drawing little Mickey mice. some of this stuff we were looking at, and we were talking about the visual style early on. Ross and myself had a lot of fun looking at some historical reference from the time period, and they had this like really early pamphleteering, like where they would make these woodblock prints pamphlets, and we kind of used that as a lot of inspiration for the style of the town. And then for the forest, we kind of we took a lot of nice research trips. A lot of our crew weren't from Ireland, so for them it was important to get into the forest and kind of get their socks wet and stuff and kind of paint, because a lot of them were for Spain and France and stuff. So they'd had a different forest experience growing up painting.
It was actually interesting. We were talking about this a while back too, and people naturally, they have a preconceived idea of maybe what a forest looks like depending on where they grow up. And even if someone grows up in a city, they might think that a forest is like managed paths through like, tidy kind of trees and shrubs and stuff. So that the one thing that we wanted to encourage people to do when we went on these trips into the forest was to get off the path and get into the brambles or the weeds and the ferns and hide down and like, imagine that like the entire forest is like this, that it's all just wild and there is no path for you to kind of, walk through, that you have to kind of imagine that, as an animal, you would have to make your own paths. And then we had our background line supervisor was from Brazil, and he naturally drew these huge, big, like, more like jungle plants in there. So people have a preconceived notion, and they don't maybe necessarily think that they're doing anything wrong until like, you point out little things. Yeah.
I'm studying with Carl Ganast anatomy, and it's so interesting. He's teaching me like anatomy by, I have to draw what's your base model. Your base model is usually yourself. You think that's the average. So if someone walks in and you go, oh, that model is tall. It's only tall compared to me. That person mightn't be, that kind of way. So everyone has their kind of visual shorthand from where they grew up or whatever. And then you kind of have to work against that. So it's interesting that a lot of us learn from other cartoons, and to try and break that down and go, okay, that's a cartoon tree, but what's a specific Irish oak tree? That kind of.
Yeah.
I was thinking, Don, earlier on, I was looking at your paintings, and I was thinking like they're beautiful. They suggest this kind of much warmer climate. There's like colors in there that I would never use if I was doing an Irish landscape. There's there's heat and warmth in there, and I think one of the things we had to do with the color background people here is say, no, you have to cool down your palette. Start using like blue greens and blue grays, and there isn't this heat that you might find in Spain or France or Italy or whatever.
Yeah, isn't that true? I've noticed that too. When you look at paintings from kind of Dutch paintings or Irish paintings or whatever, it's a lot of red and green and much cooler. And California paintings are really orange. They're very warm, and I love that because it's kind of a diary entry about what the weather was like that day. And I love that feeling to it. One thing you touched on a little bit, Tomm, was the way you handle graphically the Cromwell and the town with woodcuts, and then the forest with what seems like a really loose hand-drawn kind of approach, I thought was really clever. And without really hitting the audience over the head, it allows you to really feel a different way about each of the worlds. And can you talk a little bit about that choice? And because I think it works really well in the film.
Yeah, I mean, everything came from the characters. So Ross and I kind of felt that we wanted the Puritans and the English and the people who were settled in Kilkenny to look like woodblock prints and be quite rigid, and even their animation to be kind of rigid in one way and kind of segmented in their design. And then we love the idea of showing line tests like the old 101 Dalmatians, or, like if you look at a beautiful line test, before it goes through the cleanup process, you can feel a wildness to the line. So we thought maybe the people in town have like this hard cleanup style, and then the people in the forest are more kind of curvy and scratchy, and we can see their construction. And then that Robyn could go on this journey from being like part of the town, and it would show her mindset changing, that the scratchier and the more loosely drawn she would get. And so then obviously we always want our characters and our backgrounds to integrate as much as possible, but it's kind of fun then when you have this woodblock print style for the characters and they go into the forest, they look out of place. Or if a character from the forest Like the wolves are just like scratchy everywhere. And if you see a wolf in the town and it's kind of got this boiling style, and all the other characters have this very rigid, thick outline with offset colors, they look out of place in a way that's kind of saying something about who they are and where they're from and their mindset. So that was something we wanted. Another thing we wanted was to be as expressive as possible. We'd seen The Tale of Princess Kaguya and things like that, and we realized that a feature could be as free as a short film or a comic, and use the language of line to show what's going on inside the characters. So we felt that, you know, the wilder characters like Mebh, when they're angry, the background can be all scratchy and angry, and they can be all scratchy and angry, and the whole image can adapt to the emotions of the character. So it was kind
Just
of partly
even in that background there that we're looking at with Robyn, you can see that. You can see that everything is very, very scratchy and loose and wild and energetic, but the axe marks in the tree are the same as the town line axe marks. You know, like there's this severe black line, and they're very straight and you know, like aggressive. So we wanted to kind of explore this idea that anything that the colonizers like touched or had an impact on, like if they cut down a tree, then the tree would be left with these aggressive, like, you know, big black lines. So it was kind of their impact on the wildness, you know, and gradually destroying the wildness as they went along.
It works so well. It's just a really smart kind of approach to storytelling.
This was from an early, like we did like a promotional kind of trailer to bring the cartoon movie to find co-production partners, and that was one of the things we were trying out early on, like, you know, having the townspeople be really woodblock print style and have the
kind of very dark shadows, like lots of black and very oppressive.
Just we could quickly go through these. These are some of the explorations that we did early on. We were like, I even tried to paint Bill in the
that's fantastic.
In the style of those, you know, those really dark paintings from the time period. And he was from very early on far too interesting a character. We had Sean Bean in mind from early on, and we knew the story had to be Robyn's, and then secondarily Mav's, and then Robyn, and Bill's arc was kind of tertiary, let's say. But we kept on getting drawn into him as a character, and we actually had a lot of rewriting to do after we thought we had it in place and we put a whole animatic together. But when we watched it, we realized that we were spending far too much time setting up Bill's backstory and his whole character arc, and we were losing Robyn. She was a little bit of a witness to what was going on for him. And there was some cool scenes between him and Lord Protector, and Simon McBurney was brilliant as Lord Protector against Sean Bean, and we had to trim it right back. It was one of the biggest changes we did in the story stage, was pare the whole thing back so that we focused as much as possible on Robyn and how she discovered the world. So that way you don't need to know anything about Bill other than what she knows about him, anything but Lord Protector other than what she knows about him. And when we meet Mebh, we even had recorded with the voice actors a whole kind of parallel story of what happened to Mebh and her mom, and why her mom had disappeared and been captured. We'd whole scenes storyboarded where Lord Protector and a hunting party capture Mav's mom and all, and we stripped it all right back to just discover the world with Robyn. And it was an interesting process. It was probably the most change I've ever done in storyboard. But it was worth it.
And if we'd been making a TV series, we could have fleshed out all these interesting characters and, you know, given all the backstories and left all the unanswered questions. You know, we could have answered them all. But like we were already at 104 minutes or something, like 110 minutes, and like, you know, we always planned for a 90 or 90-ish minute film. So we well,
it's also budget. You know, it was a 10 million euro budget, and every extra minute we put on was going to make everything look a bit thinner, and we would have less opportunity to go as far with the visuals. You have to kind of
I think that's always the dilemma in animation, and but I think why this story is so good is because you slayed some of those darlings. You were able to throw out your first act and start over. You were able to, you even changed the gender of Robyn along with it, didn't you? And that was a huge change. It must have been.
It was fairly early on, though. We hadn't done, like, we'd done a few designs for Rod, and it wasn't really working. And he was feeling like a bit weird that we had to, he was almost wimpy. Like, we had to put in place conflict to show that this little boy was going against what was expected of society, and it was quite hard. But then whenever it was a girl, it just made so much sense, because she wanted to be like her dad, but society and dad were saying, no, you can't be because you're a girl. And so the theme was so much stronger. And we already had this theme of the matriarchy that the Wolfwalkers represented and the patriarchy that Lord Protector represented. And just by having Robyn be a girl, it just made so much more sense that she would be drawn towards this matriarchy. Just the freedom that Mebh experienced, the freedom that was represented by Moll's way of parenting compared to Bill's way of parenting, where she allows Mebh to make mistakes and gives her responsibility, was obviously going to draw Robyn. So that was like when we clicked on that, that was one of those early moments where we were like, oh, this is way better, like, obviously, and things developed from there.
But one of the interesting things was that Robyn's dialogue didn't have to change like entirely by changing the gender. Like a child will speak as a child, and especially nowadays, I think we're used to like kids being kids, and like gender isn't so predefined. Like it's much more fluid these days, and I think like. Robyn as a little boy had enough kind of bravado that when we changed Robyn into a little girl who was brave, that bravado was still there, so we only had to change, like, I think a couple of lines where it was very obvious about gender, about like, that girl's place is in the scullery or whatever. But a lot of Robyn's inner desires stayed the same, and the way that she expressed them stayed the same, and it was quite interesting.
I think the character actually made sense, that with the character we've been developing as a boy, it seemed a bit contrived that Dad wouldn't want him to be a hunter just like him and everything like that. But a girl, it kind of went, all right, that speaks to that kind of gender.
And it's a nice departure from your previous films, which used a bit of that, gender, and to be able to move away from that, I thought it was really strong, and did work really, really well.
It felt more comfortable, because I think it was a story that was getting very similar to Secret of Kells, with a little boy who wasn't allowed out beyond the walls, and it's just making a girl. A lot of things became more interesting, and Nora and a lot of the other women on the team were excited about the idea that our two main characters would both be girls. So we were like, oh, this is.
It also opened up like a huge theme of like patriarchy versus matriarchy, and like the woman's place in that society. Like, women had no agency in 1650 under like a Puritan overlord, So it opened up like a huge.
We got lost down a way too dark dead end, though, fairly quickly, about witchcraft, because Kilkenny has famously had witch burnings, and Kilkenny has a pretty dark history around witchcraft from that time period. And even apparently anybody from Kilkenny in Salem was originally from that time period, originally under suspicion of being a werewolf. We read that somewhere. We loved that, but it was way too dark to go. It was a kid's movie, and getting into witchcraft and burning at the stake. Sorry, I'll just keep going with the order of the presentation, because then we can chat more freely.
Yeah, please.
Sorry, because I just have these images, and this is Bruno Coulet, who did the music for Song of the Sea and Secret of Kells. And he's a French composer, and he's worked with Keela, and Keela are like an Irish folk band. And we even if you watch the movie, you'll see a lot of caricatures show up, but Keela are the band that are busking in the town. And so that was a nice continuation of that collaboration. And again, from the visuals to the music, we had this contrast to play with. So Bruno was working very much like he always does with writing the music and recording with an orchestra, and then leaving space for Keela to come in and kind of bring a bit of spontaneity and a bit of spark and stuff like that. So we kind of carried over some of the visual themes into the music that way. And then Rora made a song. I think she was like 16 or 17 when she recorded it, and I heard it by chance, called Running with the Wolves. And we knew it was like, it sounded to me like Robyn's inner voice, and it was almost too perfect. It sounded like it had been written for the story. So we used it for a long time as scratch, thinking that we'd have to replace it later. But kind of everyone started to fall in love with it, even though some people were skeptical early on about us having a song in the middle of the movie, like that sounded like a pop song. But she was open to working with us, which was great. And I know she's worked with you guys too. And like when we first came across her, I don't think she'd done any film work, but as the production went on, she showed up in Dumbo and Frozen 2 and all this stuff. So she became more known. But she was great, and she kind of adapted the song a little bit and changed the lyrics, and the music was completely reorchestrated, with Keela bringing some traditional Irish music in, and Bruno kind of having the orchestra kind of bring the song into the rest of the soundtrack, so it didn't seem as much like we were just stopping for a music clip in the middle. So
Yeah, it fits so well because you would think it's not a musical, and yet when you go to that song, it just feels really germane, really part of that kind of progression, and it's actually thrilling to hear that song over the animation during that sequence.
I know, and I went to see Frozen 2, and I watched in the credits, and I saw her name in the credits, and I remember saying to Jerry, our managing director, afterwards, I said, "Can we still afford Aurora now that she's been in like Frozen 2?" But I think she liked the movie enough; she was willing to do it for what we could do with.
Good.
So this is a little bit more what we were talking about earlier, and this is from 2017. This is some of the first stuff we did, and yeah, it's just what we were talking about, the separation between the two different worlds. And it was something that I think we were excited about, because I think like the cleanup department has really evolved in Cartoon Saloon, and we've got like really good young artists and experienced artists with us now. And it was nice to ask them something we were trying to do with all the departments, like ask them to think like filmmakers. They didn't have to just, you know, come up with a cleanup style that could be replicated across a few outsourced studios, but we were asking them to think, okay, now, you know, we're keeping the work in the co-production countries, and we've worked together so many times now. Let's push that out a bit and treat it a little bit more like a comic book inking or something, where, you know, they can really bring some of their artistry to it and not try to be as invisible as cleanup is often asked to be. Kind of, you wouldn't notice
it's
it.
really effective, because cleanup artists are often the unsung heroes of all these movies, and
so much,
yeah, to be able to see them kind of front and center is just beautiful.
Yeah, it was something that in my earliest days of my career, I always loved stuff like Michael Dudok and stuff, who would have these like inky final line. And, you know, you see one of my favorite shorts is Sisyphus by Marcel Yankovic, and every frame is a beautiful drawing. Whereas cleanup for us has always been something that we try to make as consistent as possible, because we were afraid that, you know, often our crew would be very young, and, you know, we had to just kind of make sure the character was on model, and after that everything else was a bonus. But thankfully, I think after Breadwinner, the team had matured enough, and John, our supervisor, was kind of confident enough that we could kind of go a bit further with it. So I'm really happy about that.
We ended up calling them the final line department, though, because cleanup was actually a misnomer, in that a lot of the times the rough animation was drawn so clean. And if it was a character like Mebh, they had to draw in extra rough lines and model shapes and everything. So they were roughing up the rough animation.
Yeah, I will say that like I animate pretty rough, and so I felt that like my tie down would be what you'd put on screen. And like for the trailer, it was like that. Like I did, like the animators did their own, you know, they just tied it down and we painted it. But some of the animators, especially some of the young animators, they're so amazing, but they draw so tight in their animation that we were asking the final line, can you make it scratchy? Can you pretend that? Anyway, so yeah, this is
crazy.
A little bit of history, that some of the stuff from the town. If you ever visit Kilkenny, you will see, even though we took a lot of artistic license, you will see some of the things. And then the other nice thing about, you know, we kind of were able to get the actors we wanted and the singer we wanted. Ross and I were really inspired by Cyril Pedrosa's comic, The Three Shadows, and we contacted him. And this, you'll see, this is a little boy, Robyn. This is from very early on, but he did some concept art for us. And again, it was a nice mixture of like, this is Friedrich Schaefer, who was a young intern, but turned out to have a really great feel for the almost
beautiful.
Batman. Yeah, like, and so it was a nice mixture of like more experienced people. This is Ross's work, trying to think. We were thinking, what would the land artist Andy Goldsworthy, who makes things out of just the sticks and stones he finds. We were thinking that's probably how Wolfwalkers would make things in the forest. They wouldn't, you know, so we were kind of exploring that. As usual, there's always more ideas than you can get in, you know. This is kind of, we were thinking about maps a lot too, because at the time the country started to be mapped out, and there was something about that too that was symbolic of the theme. The fact that, you know, what was wilderness and uncharted territory was becoming boxed off and named, and a lot of Irish names were being given new English names and stuff. So we at one point we were going to even have like the far distance just looks like a map in the movie because that's the part that's been colonized. At one point we were even going to have like the words of the map like written on it, like Kilkenny.
Oh, interesting.
We kind of pulled back from that. It was a bit distracting, but it was trying to be that thing that we were saying, everything that you can do with drawing or comics or try and
Yeah.
see how much of that can you bring to the screen. We thought it was super clever and revolutionary. Then we saw Into the Spider-Verse sometime in the middle of production. It's like,
Yeah, which isn't a bad comparison, but
pretty amazing.
it's
Yeah.
still, for all of the graphics and design that you put into the movie, I did not find it distracting. I found it like it contributed to the story, and the sets and the production design contributed to my feeling about the characters, which is the strength of animation when it's well done.
Yeah.
And so that was something I thought was really a positive. And the other thing, you just went by that wolf slide, I had to mention is the handling of the animation of the wolves,
Oh yeah.
amongst many other things I want to talk about. But they were handled as kind of a pack, that they were
Mhm.
like fluidly animated and
Mhm.
beautifully done as though they were an organic, continuous shape.
Yeah.
And I just thought that was a strong decision, because you could have just, thrown them all into, 20 or 30 separate wolves, but they were animated as a beautiful rhythmic shape. And I just thought that was really interesting.
It's part of how they operate compared to the army. Like the army are all like cloned kind of clockwork little men, and they all, they never fully form. They form like phalanx and stuff, but they don't become one big shape. So it was kind of, again, yeah, I'm really happy to hear you say that, and especially coming from someone like yourself. It means that like we were able to tell us like the art direction, we didn't want it to get in the way of the story. We wanted it to kind of help the story. And I think some of our previous movies, we have heard people kind of go, oh, it took me a while to get into it. And then I liked it, But for this, I think we were kind of getting better at bringing all our visual ideas together into, at the surface of the story.
I agree.
Anyway, these are just some of the concept art. Like the concept art was a lovely phase, and we were able to ask, friends. This is like Elliot Cowan's work, and we had interns working on it. And I mean, Breadwinner was in production at the time, so most people were animating on Breadwinner, but Ross and myself had a little side office, and we were able to get friends and people we were fans of to help us with concepts, and it was a really nice period. And that kind of went into a second period that was more finalizing, and that as people came off Breadwinner and were able to work with us, we were able to inherit a lot of the team. And so you can kind of see how we used scene illustrations like we always do to kind of do the key images from the movie, and they would be like a complete mock-up of everything. It would be the background plus effects plus the character, just to make sure that everything fit together right. But then the actual process of making the backgrounds is you start with a layout like this, and then there would be a team that would on paper make whether it was woodblock style or forest style, they would do it all on paper with inks or pencils. And then kind of looking at stuff like Walt Peregrine's stuff from 101 Dalmatians, we would overlay.
Brilliant.
Yeah, rather than like using cells and paint, we were just using Photoshop to overlay the line layer over very loose painted backgrounds. So it took the pressure off the background painting. A lot of the line work was kind of doing the job of describing it. And then the backgrounds were able to be a lot more
it took the pressure off in one way and then added other pressures in another way. In the same way as if you were to paint impressionistic, you don't have to think about representation, but you have to think about so much else. And the color, BG supervisor was tearing his hair out at times because he couldn't use the traditional, methods. And like the offset of the color in the town, it had to be more like printmaking. So they would only use like geometric shapes, and the, would be offset in one direction only, or like there were certain rules to the color within the town. And then in the forest, it had to be very, very like watercolory and blobby and very loose and organic, all rounded shapes, hardly like any angles or straight lines. So like there were two styles to every single department. And in the color background, even though like the line work did so much work, they had to think about so much extra stuff.
Yes, and it's deceivingly hard to simplify things. When you look at some of these colored things, or what Walt Peregrine did on Dalmatians, as you said, it's very modernist and very difficult to get things down to their simple expressions, and you see that in your backgrounds. And I can imagine it's deceivingly simple to look at these and realize how much goes into them and how much collaboration has to go into it, from the line drawing to the person that's dealing with the values and the colors. It's really a fairly
I think
sophisticated.
it's like almost like a gesture, a life drawing. You know, that if you have to get the whole impression across with even less information, it sometimes is a lot harder. You know, and sometimes it's either spontaneous and it works absolutely perfectly, or else you might have to do like 10 versions to try and get it to work. You know,
the casting was really important. Like we had
the other thing I noticed too is you brought that style into special effects, and so when I saw something, there were some very simple things like maybe a candle flame or a torch or something where the glow around it was moving boxes. And I just thought that is a graphic approach to that even Disney didn't do. And I really was excited by that, because it shows that you were bringing your graphic style out into the moving layers. And the other place you did that, which I would love to have you talk about, and I'm sure you will, is the kind of wolf vision scenes where you're moving from the wolf's point of view and you're actually animating some of these backgrounds, which is insane but fantastic.
Yeah, the first tests were done for Wolf Vision by a guy called Emmanuel Asquier, and he's an amazing animator. He's nominated for an Annie, thankfully, for his character work, but he's one of those people who can do everything. And his first degree was in philosophy, I think, and then he went back and studied animation. He's one of these people, you just gotta hate them, they're so talented. But he was like Dick Williams or something. Like, he could animate the whole background moving by hand on paper, and it was nuts. But you couldn't ask him for a retake, it wouldn't be fair. So what we ended up doing is working out with Evan McNamara, and he's a director from Dublin. This is him drawing this now. We worked out a process. I'll just skip forward and come back. We worked out this process where he would use like VR and Blender to do a rough pass like this, so we could see what he had in mind before they spent all the hours and days and weeks and months rendering it frame by frame. So they would plan it like that, very rudimentary CG. And then the final thing was all paper and pencil and charcoal. So we have a nice big stack of, because we animated
beautifully rendered papers.
Yeah. And him and his team were kind of somewhere between effects animators and background artists, because they were drawing the entire background, and they were even doing, like, he gets into it himself in other talks and stuff that, I really just tip of the hat. Like, rather than any digital blurring, this was all drawn in. They would, like, as it got to the edge of the camera, they just smudged it with putty rubbers and stuff. So it's very it was kind of something Ross and I really wanted, like, to have that sense of hand-drawn animation and celebrate. Like, the whole thing was supposed to be a celebration of what could be done with hand-drawn animation. So even when we're using digital stuff, we kind of covered it up with lots of pencily stuff afterwards.
Yeah, but it integrates so well. It just fits into the movie. And when those wolf vision scenes come on, it's just like Fantasia all of a sudden. It's just beautiful. And
yeah, like, you can see here, like, this, he doesn't actually draw this fast, Yeah, this is sped up. It was Evan and his team, I think they did 3 minutes, and it took them most of the production just for those 3 or 4 minutes that are scattered through the movie. But I think it's really worth it. And it's something we'd never done before in Cartoon Saloon. Like, Ross and me knew that the story was about changing your point of view, and we'd always done like films that were a little bit mannered in that you were looking at it like a storybook, and this was something that going into the Z-axis was going to be a big emotional turning point, that we see the world from another creature's point of view or another person's point of view. You kind of can't.
I suppose we wanted to show that, like, that Robyn seeing through our experience in the world through the wolf was such a change from her normal point of view, right? But there were 2 ways we could do it. Really, we could do it visually and like make it into a completely like different visual style, or else we could keep the visual style very similar to the normal world, but have it use the Z-axis, so it becomes this kind of roller coaster where you're flying through it. And I think that made more sense because the entire town is so devoid of perspective. It's so much like, it's so flattened, and it's very, very much like almost like a cage or a maze in itself, in that there's no like depth to it in a lot of shots. So to have her suddenly go through these environments on a Z-axis made it kind of so kind of mind altering that when she'd wake up, there's no way she could deny that she had that experience. It would be very hard for her to say, no, I'm just going to live in the town now and just forget that ever happened.
As profound as a noetic experience on psychedelics.
Yeah.
Spiritual experience.
It's so magical.
Apparently, yeah.
I know you're both fans of Richard Williams. There's a little taste of Richard Williams here and there, except, incredibly inventive. Even in the town, you see some isometric perspective or that kind of Persian miniature style that Dick used. So really wonderfully interpreted in this.
I guess for us, not Roger Rabbit. I know I was thinking Roger Rabbit because you were on that with Dick, but for us when we were in college, it was kind of after all of that, and the movie had been taken off Dick. But like I didn't even realize I was a fan of his because I'd seen his Christmas Carol and I'd seen so many of his commercials. And then we discovered the VHS tape of The Thief in college, and it had the work print that's kind of become famous now since the Academy preserved it and all, but it was on a copy of a VHS tape. And also there was a documentary with him talking about how animation doesn't have to look the same. It can look like whatever you can draw. And he was really passionate about it being like an art form. And that, I think that kind of set our like young brains on fire. And I think we've been kind of always influenced by that attitude, that whatever you can draw, you can animate, and you can use the principles that, Milt Kahl and the 9 Old Men put down to make anything move. It doesn't have to look like a Disney design to move with that Disney, emotion and stuff. So
absolutely.
That's what I think the biggest thing we took from Dick Williams. And he was very encouraging. I met him early on in my career. He was like a superhero to me, or a god or something. And then I met him at his, he gave a master class in Denmark, and myself and Fabian Erlinghauser, one of the other people from the studio, went, and he was so encouraging. He was really he was all about life drawing at the time too, which made a big impression on me. He was talking about he's kind of a missing generation, because there's the 9 Old Men generation, and then there's like kind of my generation, but he was such a teacher to all of us. And he had a reputation as being difficult, but I didn't find him that way at all, because he was only difficult about the artwork and really wanted you to do, your best work, and was not so tolerant of people who weren't after doing their best work. Yeah. So I think we just owe so much to Dick about his passion, is the only way to say it, for the art form. And it shows up in your movie, which is really lovely. Yeah, I think years ago when we did Secret of Kells, which was one that, like, when we saw The Thief, we said, maybe we can do that with Irish art, like what he was doing with Persian art. Maybe we can do that with like Irish medieval art. So I remember speaking about that, and I met his daughter, and she was really happy that because I think it had been such a sad story for them, how they'd lost control of the movie. That I think they liked the idea. I think his teaching is his biggest legacy. The fact that he wrote that book and did all those master classes, I think he inspired a generation. That
absolutely.
Sorry, I'm just showing these. I'm nearly finished. This is my last slide. These are just examples of the rest of the pipeline, which was less complicated than Wolf Vision, but more complicated than anything we tried before in the studio. So you can see here how we go from like the rough character animation to the final line, and the final line is different depending on where the characters are in their emotional journey and which part of the world they're from. And then also the ink and paint that you're seeing here was all done in TV paint as well, and a little bit the unsung heroes as well, because they were all animators. They were all people who trained in animation, so they would often in ink and paint, like say if it was a scene like this where the characters were scratchy, they would treat the paint as watercolors and have it kind of blur out, which meant they had to do a lot of stuff by hand. And in some of the scenes where there's a smear or a fast movement, like say on the bird's wings, they would make multiples. They would bring smear, they would add, so everyone was adding something. They weren't just like filling boxes by numbers. They were really thinking about what they could do to add to the movement and everything. So that was really nice. And I'm not sure if there's examples in these little clips, but if you look closely at the movie, they would have had to make a lot of decisions about these multiple frames and all the stuff I love about hand drawn that I think CG now is catching up to, but that I think is pretty unique to hand drawn, that we can do all these little tricks.
It really is. And there's CG movies are amazing. They're miracles, but to be able to pick up a pencil and interpret it in a graphic way is just an art form in and of itself, and that's what I love so much about what you've done with this film.
So yeah, that's the end of my presentation. So I hope we didn't go too long with it, but we can take other.
No, it's fantastic. I have a couple of questions, and some of which come from our listeners. Laura Gross, who you may know, brilliant kind of documentarian, she said, and this is a great question, when do you know it's time to stop? Animation especially is all about iteration. It's about, you can go back into it, you can throw out your first act, your actors are always there, your sets are always built. With me, it was always a combination of feeling that the moment is done and you can move on, but it's also, we're out of time and money. So what was your feeling about that? Like, when do you know it's time to stop iterating?
This one
we also have that thing of like, we've run out of money as well, I suppose. Like, budget has always been a concern for all of our films, because we are making it with the European co-production model, so there isn't like some private investor just going, yeah, whatever you need, just go for it. So even from the very start, when we're designing backgrounds and characters, we would have to bear the budget in mind. But I suppose
leeway. I feel on this one we had more leeway than in previous ones, and that was hard because we did the deal with Apple early on, and they weren't like adding to it kind of took, like, I'm an owner of the studio, so I'm also a producer, so I can make a fairly convincing case if I think we need to spend more money, and we did go over budget on this by about $1 million. And it was down to us really wanting to do service to the fact that this was probably the last one of these that we were going to do in this folklore trilogy. And anything that we weren't able to do, we couldn't just say, oh, we'll do it next time. So there was a bit of that. And that, you don't want to fall into the Dick Williams trap. God bless him. I think he fell into a trap of never really being able to finish because he kept adding stuff. So that was a judicious thing and an ongoing discussion between Ross and myself and, Nora and Paul and Katja, our line producer. When are we just gilding the lily a bit too much, and when do we stop? And I
think as well, our actual like line production schedule made sure that we wouldn't keep on gilding the lily, as Tomm phrased it like that. You might get a chance for like one retake, possibly 2 retakes, but by then the department has to move on to the next sequence, so you really can't ask for any more retakes.
The things that we did that were crazy that we could never have done on this was about 10 million. I think we spent about 11 on it. The previous ones were like 5 to 6 million. And like one time we'd had a crowd, there was a crowd, and I just felt they didn't, like, we had designed it cleverly that they would be like UPA style and they wouldn't move too much, so it wouldn't be really hard to do. So I thought we designed it cleverly. But I just felt they didn't have enough character. I felt like I wanted them to be much more characterful. And Federico, the designer, was doing caricatures of people. And then some of the crowd scenes were completely scrapped and redone just because I was crazy enough to say, I just can't live with it. It's just not up to snuff. And that was unpopular.
That's what it comes down to.
That was,
in a lot of cases. You used to talk to the old 9 old men at Disney, and they couldn't look at Snow White anymore because it was so full of mistakes and things that they hated, but they just had to abandon it because they were out of time after a while. Yeah. And I know that feeling, and I know you guys do too.
Mm-hmm. What blows my mind about Snow White is I watched it yesterday with my granddaughter. She's 3 years old, and she is crazy about Snow White. She wants to be called Snow White. And we watched Snow White, and I was thinking, this is like looking at a beautiful illustrated book from another century. Like, I can feel the Victorian era in it. Like, it's 1937 now, and a little 3-year-old in 2021 is watching it and getting a kick out of it and insisting that we wake her up with True Love's Kiss. She lies down. But then I
do the same thing with my wife. It's and
I said to her, so I'm the handsome prince, am I Snow White? And then she just goes, mixing all her metaphors. No, you're Olaf. You have a carrot for a nose. So she's
that's wonderful.
One level she's into. But then when she watched Wolfwalkers, that was a kick because she ran around on all fours howling. So I do really enjoy. Enjoy that animation can be as timeless as that.
And one question that came through from Mark Walton, who you may know, one of the great story artists of our time. There's a lot of what could be preachy or messagey kind of things in the film, except the film never turns out to be that way. So, sometimes you're talking about mysticism versus Christianity, or English versus Irish, or Catholics and Protestants, or industrialization and nature, or women's roles in society, and all that stuff. And yet none of that, to me anyway, comes across as being preachy.
Oh, good.
How do you balance that? Because I've always thought, and you probably feel the same way, the minute you come across as sending a message, you kind of lose the audience. And I never felt that way. And yet all of those conversations are built into the movie. So Joe Grant, the great story artist, used to say the conversation in the car on the way home from the cinema is what you want the audience to talk about, those kinds of things. How do you incorporate those messages without feeling like it's preachy?
That was
I think from very, very early on, myself and Tomm and Will were aware that we were dealing with some topics that, like, if we address them head on, could come across as being very preachy. And I think Tomm, myself, as like, we were vegetarian since teenagers, and then like went into veganism. Tomm is like fully vegan now. And I think we made the mistake of being that preachy vegetarian when we were teenagers and early 20s, and you just turn people away. You just, like, if someone feels that they're being preached at, they're going to go, all right, I'm going off now to eat more meat because of that. So I think we learned the hard way through many, many years of that.
I still haven't learned, but anyway.
That the only way you can really, like, change someone's mind is for them to change their own mind about it, like that you supply them. Yeah, you supply them maybe with some information and ask a question, and then leave them to go and ask the question to themselves. And the worst thing you can do is kind of go, no, you're wrong, or like this is wrong, or whatever. And I think we found it easier to focus just on Robyn and Mebh's journey, and their experiences, and like on them becoming friends, and like this nice emotional journey between the two of them. And like all the stuff that could be quite preachy is really a backdrop, and we don't really delve into a lot of it, like, really fully. Like, Robyn doesn't sit up and kind of go, colonialism is certainly having a bad effect on this land, So it's just there. It's there for the conversation afterwards. And, we have had mixed messages. Like, I was just reading messages the other day from Irish historians, saying that we didn't really explore colonialism enough. And we're kind of going, yeah, but then it would have been a different film if we had started dealing with these things head on.
I also don't agree. There's a modern trend to impose like modern values on history a bit too much as well. And even though we are speaking to contemporary concerns, we have to be careful not to become didactic and sort of, allowed to be the background and have the questions come from the characters. I mean, after all, we went full Tarantino and killed off Oliver Cromwell at the end of the movie. So,
thankfully there's no like Oliver Cromwell fans nowadays that are going, oh, how could you do that? He's like,
I was wondering about that. I thought you can't kill Cromwell because he's still got to be around for another few years. Yeah,
but he survives. He just falls into the waterfall and climbs out downstream. But I think the hardest thing though for Tomm myself though was the animal rights issues, because that was one of the reasons why we started writing the story in the very beginning. But I think though we came across the natural nuances that exist in every kind of like argument, that it isn't all black or white. And so like for us to have an anti-hunting message would be really wrong, because the wolves are hunting other animals. So if we take the side of the wolves, then like what's the rabbit story? The rabbit is like, oh, these big bad.
The stuff I related to around all that was I've been studying a little bit the crossover with Native American beliefs and the idea of an honorable harvest as opposed to a kind of obliteration of a species is more what we wanted to speak about. And in terms of Christianity, we lost it a little bit early on. We sort of had Moll represent that more syncretic way of seeing, finding faith in nature. So we're not like anti-Christian, but we're anti-extremist. We're anti-killing in the name of Christianity, because to me that's a oxymoron. The idea that you would kill somebody in the name of like a peaceful religion. So we're not sort of saying, we're trying not to be extremist, and that's what the whole story is about. So we're trying to be open-hearted.
Yeah, it's really effective and hard to cover that ground. And it's funny you use the kind of native First Peoples view of nature, and we we try to do a little bit of the same thing in Lion King, because you're dealing with the same issues. You're dealing with characters that eat other characters, and somehow you have to take that kind of holistic, noble kill, as you say, kind of version of it all. I wanted to talk about a couple other people also on your team before we wrap up.
Sure.
One is James Baxter, who is only kind of a visitation at your studio for a short time. But for those of you who don't know him, James Baxter is a really kind of special, brilliant animator who I think I hired him back on Roger Rabbit in London when he was just out of school. And he was downstairs doing in-betweens for Nick Ranieri. And Nick said, there's this guy downstairs doing my in-between who's a lot better than I am. And so, but James came over and did a workshop for you guys, did a little bit of animation, and wrote the foreword to your Abrams book. And those of you, actually, let me plug your book, because before you, if you want a deeper dive into Wolfwalkers, there's this amazing Charles Solomon book on the Wolfwalkers that you all should grab, because it's a great kind of recap of everything we've been talking about. Talk about James, why you had him over, why he was a contributor to this film.
There was two kind of amazing quadruped wildlife Disney, trained people, James and Aaron Blaze, who both were very generous. They both gave workshops it was not, Aaron was the first that we got in touch with, and he did some designs as well for his early designs to help us, because we'd done quadrupeds before, but they were very stylized. And although we wanted to do a very stylized version of the wolves, we also wanted them to be believable, and we wanted it to be based on, really good anatomy and understanding of it. And so he was the first to come along. And then I'd met James years before at a party in Miriam's house, and his daughter loved Song of the Sea, and I was flabbergasted that James Baxter even knew who we were or what our movies were or anything, which was lovely.
Oh yeah.
And he said he wanted to work on the next one, so we sort of kept that up. And then I ended up on the exec committee in the academy with him, and I ended up sitting beside him, and kind of kept on coming. And then I was so delighted when he ended up in Netflix, because he had a little bit of an excuse to come over, because we're doing our next feature with Netflix, and he was part of the Kilkenny Animated Festival. And so he came over and did, like, in the Church of Animation. One of our studios is in our old secondary school, St. Kieran's College, that has a church in there that we've started to use for lectures. So James sat up on the altar with a projector behind him and live animated for us all, and we all sat in the pews. And so James was
that's beautiful.
Our preacher. And then it was really lovely, because we knew that running with the wolf sequence had to be really good. And I even remember seeing the storyboards and going, geez, I wouldn't like to have to animate that. So he took some of those hard scenes with the wolves running in perspective on a moving background and a pack of wolves behind, and he knocked it out of the park. So it was just a pleasure,
I think it's one thing though, that like in Cartoon Saloon, like when we were in Secret of Cows days, even getting people like Cyril Pedrosa to do concept art for us, or getting James Baxter to animate a scene, like it's in your wildest imagination you would still say that it's not possible. And I think like Cartoon Saloon, each time it's released something and it's been successful, those dreams are getting a little bit more tangible. So when we reached out to people like Cyril Pedrosa and James Baxter, probably our first reaction was like, they're not going to say they want to do that. They're going to say they're busy. And then when they say yes, your jaw hits the floor. It's just, it's still mind-blowing.
And I think that's been one of the most gratifying things for me in my career in Cartoon Saloon. Like, we're still in our hometown here in Kilkenny, where we grew up, and we've got some amazing, James did beautiful work, but some of our animators now have gotten so good. Like, there's a young woman, Anita Goen, who's brilliant at quadruped animation. And the fact that she's, from here in Ireland, from not far away from the studio, and is able to have her scene side by side with a James Baxter scene, and like that kind of stuff is just lovely to me. The idea that we've been able to bring those kind of masters to Kilkenny, it's crazy. It's so nice.
Yeah, I think you've arrived at a certain level where people will say yes, because they are such fans of your work. And it's the hand-drawn animation that you do is so unique. And people ask me a lot of times when I do interviews, will Disney ever do a hand-drawn film? And I don't know the answer to that, but I always tell them there's great hand-drawn animation being done in Ireland, in Japan, in different places that is in Spain,
France
that is
and Spain, yeah,
as brilliant in its own way as some of those Disney films are. The last kind of group I want to talk about is your editors, because nobody ever talks about editors. And I think the editing in this film is really works really well. And the combination of editors and story people, storyboard artists, and working with you in the editing room and really trying to craft a sequence is something as a process that we don't talk about in animation, but it's where a lot of the work gets done, of you sitting with your editors